Ronald, for joining us.
Good evening, Richard. Good evening. Thanks for the invitation.
My apologies again. Things started a little bit later than expected. As you know, with all the developments in the Middle East, we have to also keep abreast with that. Now, let's be honest, right? There's so much to discuss, Dr. Holmes. I mean, first of all, of course, just to be clear, we were colleagues back in the day in LaSalle. We have been friends for quite some time. So I can say with a lot of confidence that I'm familiar with you, with your works. Of course, your integrity, you as being one of the leading political scientists in the country. I think people forget that you're not just a Pulse Asia chief, but you're also one of the leading political scientists who has written fantastic stuff on populism and politics in the Philippines. So I hope today, I can not force you, but you'll be wearing two hats, right? Both as a political analyst and also as the guy who's in charge of Pulse Asia. So before we go to the siguro mas mainit na issues that I know, you see them coming. Uh, let's just talk about you. So Professor Holmes, how did you end up in Pulse Asia? What is the backstory here? I mean, I was very, back in the day when I was a student in UP. Of course, one of the professors I was very used to was very close to, was Pepe Miranda, right? And in fact, you get the right to call him Pepe Dao if you top his class, which something that we afforded to do at some point. So Pepe Miranda is someone who's very familiar to me from my undergraduate days, and so there's a backstory to that. What I wanted to understand is how did you end up in Pulse Asia, and tell us a little bit about that. What's Pulse Asia? What's its history? How did you end up in Pulse Asia, and the chief of Pulse Asia for that matter?
Well, first, Richard, you can just call me Ronnie, like Pepe. Um, I After I was with Pulse from the beginning as a group, part of a group academics. That was 1999. The main reason for that is that I worked with Pepe in one social weather stations project
Ah,
earlier. I think that was in 1997. But prior to that, I was doing surveys, largely to LaSalle, the Social Development Research Center. So in this sense, I've been doing surveys since 1994. No? It's been quite some time. I From 1999, the date when the year when Pulse was founded, I was on and off, no, because I was doing school administration. And when I resigned from school administration in 2008, prior to the resignation actually, I was approached to take on the presidency of Pulse. So I decided then that I'll take it on, no, 2008. So from that date, from that year, I've been president of Pulse, and it's been quite a challenging work. Um, so that was also the time. I think 2 years before that, Pepe had already more or less semi-retired from Pulse. He was still doing work, but he had given up the presidency.
let me ask you, were you a kind of a stat person? Were you a numbers person? Because usually the joke with political science is this is a guy who didn't like numbers and therefore went there. But what was this backstory to you? I mean, were you fascinated by the science of survey and public opinion measurement?
I'm not a stats person. We do have a statistician. The
Mm.
statistician in our case is Dr. Ana Tabunda. Used to be the dean of the School of Statistics at UP. I do understand statistics. I'm more of a quality
Mm.
researcher. My research has really been more qualitative. Although I like looking at numbers, but I'm not the, to the extent that quite positivist. No? That I'd like to explain certain things working with, let's say, looking at correlations and looking at regressions. I
Right.
do understand it, but I think the context is quite important.
Right.
So in this case, I'm literate, but not necessarily an expert in terms of statistics. I would leave
Right.
that to the statistician.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I ask is because, speaking of Pepe Miranda and also my colleague in Philippine Daily Inquirer, Dr. Mangas, no? I mean, these were people who were part of the whole Chicago University behaviorist revolution. I think thanks to Pepe, kahit mga Pol Sci students, we were forced to take calculus, right? Among others. So, hindi lang, basic algebra and all, even calculus. Of course, given na in statistics. That's the context because we know that in our field in political science, there's some people who are hardcore quantitative, right, and moving that direction, including folks where you got your PhD, of course, at the Australian National University. So I just wanted to clarify that because for some reason we've been friends and colleagues for quite some time, but I never got a chance to ask you how much of a stat geeky guy you are. But essentially what you're saying is that you're literate, so you're not totally clueless about this, obviously, but you have
Uh,
really stat experts there in Pulse Asia to take care of that
yeah.
business. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I do get to process some data, but I normally use an application rather than do the programming. The statisticians do the programming. I'm not yet into programming, neither R nor Stata. I basically work with SPSS in terms of the statistical processing. So I don't know the syntax. I know what
Right.
application, what process needs to be done, but that's about it. I will not go into the actual computation per se.
Right. But of course, something that I notice in your works is you're very evidence-based, numbers-based in terms of your qualitative analysis, right? Like you're not gonna make opinion about, not gonna make an analysis about, let's say, populism in the Philippines, just out of nowhere. You look at also the numbers and what public opinion does. Those are the things that I see in your literature. I'm just saying this for folks who are trying to
And,
understand, where you're coming from. Now, can we slightly also talk about Pulse Asia? So, what are the origins of Pulse Asia? Because I think this is also something very important. Because we have SWS and then we have Pulse Asia. Essentially, these have been the two pillars of scientific, credible, non-partisan public opinion measurement in the Philippines for quite some time. Can you give us a little bit of history of that also, Ronnie? Yeah.
I think, well, it was in 1999 that Pepe established it. There was a group of academics together with Pepe. We were part of that group. There were about, I think, 10 of us, but in the board there were about 5 people. That included Pepe, Mercy Abad, who's also a market research
Right.
guru. So 1999, that was the time that Pepe also left the social weather stations. Pepe and Mahar are founding fellows of the
Yeah.
social weather stations. So it became the second, well, not exactly second, but one of the
Top two. Yeah.
few
Yeah.
major research organizations, because you have long-standing organizations such as the Philippines Survey Research Center, aside from the social weather stations. So there are a number of market research groups, but Pulse and SWS are the ones that are known to conduct the regular quarterly assessments of the national administration, as well as political issues.
Now, before we go to the more perhaps mainit or contentious part of our discussion and conversation, for that matter, in general, how important is this development? I mean, kumpara dun sa mga panahon na walang scientific surveys, ano yung ambag ng scientific surveys? I know that, Pepe Miranda, of course, had a very important chapter about public opinion and democracies and measurement of that. How important is having scientific surveys to healthy democracy, for that matter? Yeah.
You do get the sense. That's why I think this was one of the reasons why Pepe, for example, labeled the quarterly survey as Ulat ng Bayan. Because
Right.
what we often hear as opinion that is normally circulated, disseminated, would be the opinion of a few. You do have the elite, then you have
Yeah.
intellectuals, you have commentators. But we rarely are able to surface the opinion of the public, regardless of whether this opinion, from the perspective of some people, would be baseless or not. But we need to surface the opinion of the public. And that's the important thing about systematic surveys. No? You're trying to get a gauge of the public's pulse at a particular point in time, and you do it systematically. It may not necessarily be, from the perspective of critics, an informed opinion, but
Yeah.
nonetheless, it's an opinion that we need to work with, whether you're in government or outside government. Sometimes you have to think, Richard, no?
Yeah. Yeah.
Why is it that people hold this opinion? Why is it that
Exactly.
people tend to go towards a direction that you think is inappropriate? But you have to accept that that is what they believe in. Now, the challenge for both government and, let's say, for educators like us is to find ways in terms of trying to change that opinion to something that we think will be more favorable. Favorable in the sense that it will address a problem,
Right.
or it will lead towards, in my case, my passion is towards leading towards more political engagement,
Right. Right.
on the part of the public. But that's something that we do gather in a systematic fashion. So it's really a challenge in terms of getting the public's opinion relative to the opinion of the few. understand that there are differences and that we need to be able to calibrate what our actions are then as it relates to, let's say, the prevailing public opinion.
Thank you for that, Ronnie. I mean, going back to this when it comes to, so essentially what you're saying here is nagkaroon ng boses ang taong bayan. Like there were already these opinions, but for a long time we were really relying on the narrow elite to tell us ano yung iniisip ng mga tao, di ba? So thanks to scientific surveys, you're giving voice to the people. In fact, so much so that their voice becomes part of the conversation. And in our own experience as political analysts, a lot of times our own voice is shaped by this voice, right? So it completely changes the dynamic. So in that sense, it contributes to deepening and pluralistic nature of our democracy. I think that's a very important point to mention here. Now, just in terms of the operational aspect, so like because our understanding is like survey agency, like ikaw isang politiko, gusto mo malaman kung may chance kang manalo sa Senate or President or something like that, pupunta ka, and of course, this is not for free, you have to, give a certain fee, etc. So, how do we go from that to the ones that are freely shared with us, other academics, people in the media? Di ba dapat ang mga surveys are, essentially commissioned? So what is the difference between commissioned as surveys and the ones that you release? I mean, or when did this start? Now you're releasing your data for public consumption, considering how expensive and difficult it is to come up with this nationwide scientific surveys.
Well, it's part of the mission of Pulse to do the quarterly surveys. These are non-commissioned surveys. The survey questions are essentially framed by Pulse. We do have a set of regular questions that we ask every quarter. You have the assessment of the national administration, the major concerns that people feel the administration should address, among others. So, regardless of whether there are subscribers or not, we conduct those surveys on a quarterly basis.
Right.
The difference between that and a commission survey is that the commission survey is financed by someone else. It's not financed by Pulse.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that the commission survey would come up with results that are favorable to the commissioning entity.
Right.
Essentially, Richard, it's the same thing that we do in research. When an
Exactly.
external agency taps us to do research, we conduct the research adhering to the norms of social science research.
Right.
And we report out the findings regardless of whether these are favorable or unfavorable to the commissioning entity. That's the same with regard to commission surveys. If it turns out that the results of the survey are unfavorable to the commissioning entity, we'll just tell them those results. There's no way that we will agree to fudge the data or alter the data so that it will suit their interests, because
Right.
that to us will also not be serving the interests of the commissioning entity. It's basically falsifying data for the sake of really pleasing them, which will not necessarily be good also for their interests, because if they're lagging behind in the pre-election
Yeah.
contest, and you give them a result that shows that they're not, then what would that do to their own strategy? That's just basically fooling them.
Yeah.
So I think people should be disabused from the belief that commission surveys are surveys that would tend to favor the commissioning entity. No, that is not the case. Not at least for reputable
Yeah,
organizations
exactly. Yeah.
that we know of, including Pulse.
Yeah.
It's just that there's a different funder for that matter, and it's not internally funded.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, if you come up with mumbo jumbo results and then sa actual elections, hopeless yung lumabas, then then you have no credibility. Why should I come to you if you're just gonna feed me delusions, right? But that brings us to another issue, Ronnie, no? The issue of yung argument na surveys shape opinion, or my mind conditioning aspect to that. You have also written academic works on that. I've also looked at the literature throughout the years. What is your take? Because I think your take is quite nuanced on that. No, I mean, obviously, look at a lot of our presidents. They were not the expected presidents, or even if they were the expected presidents in elections, the margins sometimes were not expected. So, I'm not sure about the mind conditioning argument, but for the sake of discussion, anong take mo dyan sa mind conditioning argument that the surveys are just a propaganda to shape? So essentially self-fulfilling prophecy sila. That's the kind of counter argument we usually hear.
Well, it's pretty difficult to say it's mind conditioning, because there are basically, and we've seen this in our pre-election surveys, you've seen shifts in terms of
Yeah, exactly.
preferences from one survey to another. And the studies that have been done in other countries will point towards two types of effects of surveys. One is the bandwagon. There's a
Right.
tendency, supposedly, for people to follow the survey results and vote according to the survey results. Whoever is leading will be supported. The other one is the underdog effect, which is the opposite. No? If you're really passionate about a candidate and that candidate is lagging behind in the survey, then you will mobilize more support for that candidate. So those two, even just by those two, they tend to nullify one another, no? Equalize yung effect between bandwagon and
Right.
the underdog. But what we have established in our own studies is that surveys have very little influence on voting behavior.
Right.
It's self-serving. That's why we do not necessarily publicize it. Because when we ask people what sort of information influences your voting behavior, and we include survey results as one of those, there are about 11, there's a tendency for the survey results to be at the bottom of the list.
Right.
They will say that news about the candidate is important, information coming from family members is important. So surveys are not as consequential in terms of influencing voting behavior. So that's the reason why we say
Mm.
it does not necessarily condition at least voting decisions. Um, now, it that's and I think it's good for other social scientists to do the studies in terms of whether it does condition,
Yeah.
because we do our own, but it would be really, and that's why I always encourage social scientists to do the independent study. We
Yeah.
provide them the data, we provide them opportunities to
Exactly. Yeah.
even write onto our surveys, at least the reputable ones, and if they come up with different findings, then it is up to them to publicize it. And those are based largely on data that we gather or data that we provide to them.
Yeah, I mean, after all, I mean, people forget these are snapshots, right? These are snapshots of what's the situation when the surveys was conducted, and it's not deterministic in a sense that malalaman mo exactly what will happen in a week. I mean, we saw the huge movements up and down, and you're saying obviously there's a dialectical process. Minsan kung leading ka sa survey early on, ikaw pa yung maging target ng iba, di ba? And then yeah, and then
Yep.
you can adjust your. Obviously, I mean, if you want to help your client in commission surveys, maybe realistically you could tell that person, I think, strength and weaknesses more, but you cannot doctor the numbers, or you cannot expect to tell them we can condition the mind of people, because there are other survey agencies who can provide more accurate one, and the next time, wala na kayong kliyente, right? I mean, we're just trying to parang play devil's advocate here, because Ronnie, to be honest, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding out there now. One of the other big misunderstandings, I think this is where we have to go to the science part of this. What is a scientific survey when it comes to gauging public opinion? Because obviously, this is not census. I keep on hearing, sa buong buhay ko, hindi pa ako na-interview ng Pulse Asia or SWS. Therefore, hindi ko alam sinong kausap nila. Let's explain to them that this is not the census, right? I mean, even with census, sometimes you get skipped. Can we explain to them what is the representative sample? What is the, how do we make sure that what's the dirty kitchen process that goes into measuring, opinion of the whole nation based on a representative sample?
Well, just remember, Richard, we have a adult population of what, close to 70 million right now.
Yeah.
And normally in a survey, we get what, 1,200, 2,400. So the chance of one getting interviewed is quite minimal. Actually,
I mean, less
one
than
of our-
winning bingo, no? I mean, bingo, I think 25 million or something like that.
less than winning the lotto.
Like, exactly, mas may chance ka manalo ng lotto. Like,
As
yeah.
one of my colleagues wrote
Yeah.
in one article that appeared in a network, it's easier to get to find a soulmate than be a respondent in a survey.
May hugot pa. Yeah.
So, mas madali ka pa makahanap ng BFF o forever mo kaysa sa survey.
Correct.
The main reason is that, it's basically, in our case, for example, the multi-stage sampling, what we do is that we first divide the sample that we decided on in the sub-national areas. So we have 1,200. We decided whether we will distribute this equally into the
Yeah.
4 areas, 300 each, which we normally do. And then in each of those areas in the National Capital Region, we cover all of the cities and municipality here. But that means basically getting 300 in the entire NCR. And if you have
Right.
a population of, let's say, more than 1 million in Quezon City, we draw about, 60 in Quezon City, 45 to 60. So that means that that's a chance of people in Quezon City. So it's a very minimal chance. In the balance of Luzon, then you're covering a larger area
Right.
here. We draw randomly the city municipality, and then from that city, we draw the barangay. And then from that barangay, we randomly identify the starting point. And in the household, we randomly select the respondent. So it's pretty rare for someone to be selected. As long as you do the random selection,
Yeah.
which is essentially the probabilistic, the explanation here is that everyone has a chance to be selected as part of the sample. So as long as you do that, then you can say that it's representative within a given margin of
Yeah.
error. No? I remember my neighbor was selected. And I live in
Patay tayo
Bacoor.
dyan.
My
Yeah.
neighbor was selected, and immediately after being selected, she talked to my mom and said, I think Pulse Asia just interviewed me. Sabi ko, dapat pumunta sa bahay, no?
Yeah.
Because I myself have not been interviewed
That,
by
that was
any
close, ah. That was close na
by
may interview
survey
president.
organization. And I do have published with census. Minsan,
Yeah.
hindi rin kami nahagip ng census, no? But that's the thing here. You need to do it probabilistically.
Yeah.
As the statisticians explain it, it's like essentially tasting your food. No, you
Yeah.
mix it properly, and then you get it from the bottom, rather than eat the entire dish. Because if you eat the entire dish, you don't have anything
Yeah.
else to eat.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think I had my own version of, I don't know, either parang version of pizza or something like that. You know, like you don't need to eat the whole pepperoni to know whether it tastes good. You just get the parts that has the cheese, the pepperoni, and the bread, right? Just that it's like being a food critic. You know, I mean, it's like if you're from Michelin, right? You want to start. You don't have to eat the whole thing. The food critics just look at the parts. You get tiny parts of everything, you put it together, and you have an idea how it works. I think when we explain it that way, mas get tao how representative sample works. Now, that's conceptual. Ron, I'll push you a little bit. I remember when I was doing stat back in the day undergraduate, we did surveys in Payatas, if I'm not mistaken. And I remember something like back, and actually yung survey namin about potential mayors and council, it turned out correct. This is long time ago, obviously. So I was very impressed with what we did as students, no? From my, medyo faint yung memory ko, but from what I remember is like, yung teacher namin back in the day said something like, parang what like when you go there, like parang randomly pick someone, like I mean like there's a process there. Like, can you explain to us, like kunyari, when you walk into a barangay, how do you choose which house to go to, like on the ground level? So I think we explained scientifically how it works. It's like you don't need to eat the whole pizza to know whether masarap siya. You can get the slice that has all the ingredients. That gives you an idea, right? Proportional to actual, full combination. Now, but on the ground, let's go dirty kitchen naman. How is it done? Like when you send your folks to do surveys, how is it done? Can we explain? Kasi feeling ko Ronnie, marami kasing mystification here, no? So let's demystify it para the mumbo jumbo speculations go away.
Yeah, so for example, at the barangay, when we select the barangay, we basically identify a random starting point. That random starting point might be, let's say, the church. There are certain barangays, especially in the urban areas, where you have a map of the barangay, right? So we
Okay,
can say,
there's
for
a map.
example, in this barangay, we start from the church. And from that church, you count, let's say, in an urban area, every 5 households. So the 6th household is the household where you select a random respondent.
Okay.
So in some barangays, of course, that 5th household may actually be in the 3rd story of a building. Right, Richard?
Right.
In Metro Manila, for example,
Right,
mahirap ka
exactly, yeah.
makakita
Correct.
sa informal settlements na meron ka mga structure na 5 palapag, pero ang household dyan maaaring 10.
Right.
So that's what we mean by household. It's not the structure per se, it's the household. And in that household, basically from that starting point, you follow the interval, and then you start off with from the 6th household. And then after the 6th household, you follow again, 5. You enter the next one, and you try to select a respondent. In that household, the respondent to be selected is either male or female, depending on the last number of the questionnaire. So the questionnaire is odd. The last number is odd, then it's male. If the last number is even, then it's female. Then there's a quiche grid. There's a table where you list down the members of the household And then that case grid basically identifies who should be the respondent, how random should be the selection of respondent. So if it's even, the ending is even, only the female members of the household, you will only select randomly from the female members of the household who are adults,
Right.
because we normally interview adult respondents only. So that's how random it is. In rural areas, the interval is about two households because in rural areas, Richard, it might be there's one household here and the next household will be a
Yeah,
kilometer away.
exactly.
So in that case, the interval is smaller than the interval that we follow in urban
So
households.
you adjust it to the topography and essentially the how
Yep.
residential areas and people essentially are distributed. And again, just for an idea of, for instance, there's certain areas na medyo suddenly unstable or there's like war, etc. How do you make sure that that doesn't affect the representative sampling process, for instance? Yeah.
There, then you do a substitution of
Mm,
the barangay per se.
right.
And the substitute barangay should basically have the same characteristic as the initial barangay that was randomly selected.
So
So
comparative sample.
comparative, for example,
Yeah,
we
yeah.
go to an area that we know is
Comparable, sorry. Yeah.
conflict affected.
Right.
Without knowing that there are barangays that are conflict affected, we selected one barangay. Or it might just be simply a barangay that was affected by a calamity. Well,
Right.
Richard, it's not a question of conflict. There are occasions wherein
Yeah,
we have
Yolanda, right? Whole Visayas
yeah,
areas list.
yeah, we have our surveys close to about a week after a typhoon hit a particular area, but that area could not in any way be accessed. So what happens is that there's always that random selection of a substitute barangay. We cannot exclude barangays immediately just because we think that they cannot be accessed.
Yeah.
The only barangays that we normally are able to exclude are the barangays that are impenetrable because they're exclusive. And that's the reason why we don't get so much of the A and B
The
classes.
real A is it Dasmariñas and like Forbes. Good luck.
That's
Yeah.
Marinas or
Yeah.
those high-class
Yeah.
condominium
Right.
units where you cannot really enter. And if you do enter, it might be really, you would basically be picked up by the security. So those are barangays that when we select, we know that it's basically impossible for us. In those barangays, in those areas, basically the survey method that you use is not anymore the method that we normally use, which is probabilistic. You can do more purposive sampling there, like snowball or chain referral,
Right.
but that won't be as representative. I mean, that won't be easy to generalize. It may
Yeah.
be representative only for that survey, but you cannot say that this is true for all of those who belong to that class because it's not done probabilistically.
Uh, Now, before we go to the digital surveys, because I'm sure that's a topic we'll be interested to talk about, let's stick to this because, a few years ago there were reports that not your survey agency, but apparently another survey agency daw, there was a situation whereby yung mga tao na in charge of doing the surveys, apparently were just filling it up themselves. Like some mumbo jumbo was happening. I don't know kung tinamat sila or they were not able to do it properly on the ground. How do you guard against those kinds of situations? How do you guard the guardians, right? Or how do you make sure that the folks that you send out there to do the surveys are really going to the right person? What kind of safeguard mechanisms are there?
Well, a certain number of surveys are supervised. That means we have people who
Mm,
are actually going with the interviewers, the enumerators in those surveys. There are people that have higher responsibility securing that the interviewers are actually doing their jobs. The other one is what we call spot check. A proportion of surveys that are completed are checked again by randomly by
yeah.
our field supervisors. That means they go back to the place where a survey was conducted. They verify that the survey was done. They ask questions that were similar to the
Yeah.
questions that were asked. So in that case, you find out whether the survey was actually done. At the end of each day, another way to check it, at the end of each day, you do have a meeting between the interviewers and the field supervisor where they try to look at the completed surveys. And if there are errors or there are deficiencies that are found, the surveys are repeated.
Yeah.
I think this was one of the things that was misreported at one point. No, it was not ours.
No,
It was another
it's not with
agency.
Pulse Asia. I mean, the
But,
report.
but but
Yeah, yeah,
but it was with another agency. But
yeah.
it was not necessarily a process that was bad, because normally at the end of the day, the interviewers and the field supervisors gather in one place, and then they check the completed questionnaires.
Mm,
They do not add to what was answered, but they simply check it, because
yeah,
if a number of the questions are not answered, you need to repeat that interview.
yeah.
So that's what you call field editing, and it's done at the end of the day, just to check whether the survey was done appropriately. Because if so many questions are not answered, that means that that particular
Baka
interview
ma-nullify. Yeah,
is quite deficient,
yeah.
right? So then you will have to really do another interview, or discard that one if need be. But if you do have the time, then you do and follow the protocol in terms of substituting for substitute it with another interview.
Well, the next question when it comes to this safeguards and house cleaning and all of those things, the other question is, and I think this is where you and I see self-aware ako. You and I had back in the years, some sort of slight disagreement perhaps on this, but I mean, the argument is how do you make sure that people are fully comfortable with sharing their honest opinion, especially in certain areas where you have, I mean, essentially warlords are the congressman or warlords are the barangay chairman, or where you had, as in recent cases, like high incidence of EJK. I mean, you can imagine people have trust issues with anyone asking them about their real opinion, and perhaps people would try to err on the side of caution. Um, Obviously I talked about fear factor in the past, but that's my take, and you have your different take. What are the safeguards against that? How do you make sure that people feel comfortable enough to share their honest opinion in some extreme circumstances? Obviously, Ronnie, that's not the case everywhere and all the time, but here and there could be some some distortionary effect because of the extraordinary circumstances. What are your ways of dealing with mitigating those kinds of circumstances?
Well, one is that we do not force anyone to be a respondent.
Right.
So they're allowed to refuse any interview. So we do track our refusal rates. So the refusal rates have remained the same. So when you say, let's say in an area where people are apprehensive that they might be
Yeah.
surveyed, and there are people who are looking behind their shoulders, behind them,
Yeah.
then you you do expect that people will refuse, but our refusal rates have not changed. Before we conduct the survey, we read to them the consent form. We tell them what the survey is all about. We tell them that they have the right to not answer any of the questions. At any point, if they wish to withdraw from the survey, then they can do so. Uh, so in this sense, we allow them to just simply refuse answering any question.
Mm-hmm.
If they feel that they were intimidated, my number is there also, and the
Right.
number of our research director. They can call us at any time. No? So basically, what we do is that we assure them that the survey is done for a particular purpose in that consent form, and before the survey starts, we get their oral consent.
Yeah.
Um, Now,
You record
we
that? The
also
oral
secure,
consent, Ronnie? Nare-record ba yan? Or like, what's the
well,
process?
yeah, it's basically binabasa, and then the interviewer basically knows that the person agreed to be interviewed.
Mm.
In certain cases, some of them would ask that that one would be signed. No? But it's a consent form. Then they're given our numbers, basically, the responsible researchers there. The other thing is that we secure anonymity. No one knows.
Mm.
I don't even
Right.
know who are interviewed. Because anonymity means that because I'm far removed from them. No? The
Yeah.
only one who knows their address, their identity, their contact numbers will be the interviewer. Right?
Yeah.
I would not know it. And our rule is that we should not in any way get any information as to who the specific details,
Yeah.
the names, the telephone numbers, and addresses of the ones who are interviewed. We secure anonymity and we secure confidentiality. So eventually, what we see will be respondent numbers. Um, we don't also release the areas that we went to.
Uh-huh.
No one knows that.
Mm.
No one knows that. No one knows where we're going to before we conduct the survey. There are very few of us who would know the areas that we sampled. And after the survey, our subscribers will never know exactly what barangay we went to. At
Mhm.
most, what they will find out will be the province.
Right.
So in this case, it's one way to see. Well, if someone really intends to um, manipulate the surveys, then they will have to go to all of the municipalities and barangays in the country,
Yeah.
which is close to impossible, right? Because we only select what 1,200 respondents. At most, that means that in each barangay we only select five. So, what you normally do have is a very random selection, and it's quite difficult to say that once we select this barangay, that in this barangay there's that fear factor. We will not exclude that factor. Uh, we
Mm-hmm.
will not exclude what other
Right.
social scientists would call falsifying preferences.
Right. Right.
There may be reasons behind it,
Mm-hmm.
but um, it's pretty difficult, no, to
Yeah.
really gauge it when the interview is being conducted.
Yeah.
Richard. I myself have done those interviews.
Right.
I've observed some of our interviews. I note how the non-verbal behavior of
Mm.
respondents.
Yeah.
But more often than not, our rule also is that no one should be in the room aside from the interviewer and the respondent as much as
Yes,
possible.
I wanted to ask that, yun nga, Ronnie, like, are your folks trained to make sure na hindi sila sinusundan, I don't know, tanod, or, dodgy people? Again, I understand, because Pulse Asia was established when, you had a more or less semi-functioning democracy, right? But of course, some realities change, unfortunately, over the past few years. So, I'm just trying to play the devil's advocate here. Kung people have the proper training to make sure that first, pag you walk in and ask, hello po, I mean, first of all, you're not scary or intimidating, and second, you're not being followed by some dodgy person, which may give, weird ideas to the person na baka kailangan ko na fill up. So first, you clarified now, no one is forced to fill it up. And second, it's anonymous. Third, no one is being paid to do it. So kung ayaw mo, di wag kung natatakot ka. But again, for the sake of transparency, I just wanted to make sure, parang ginawa kong confidential fund, ano to. No, but we really have to, kasi Ronald, frustration nga, like you're always asked on media to give your analysis, but I think there's not enough questioning about what goes, the processes that
Yeah.
go into what you're doing para lang ma-appreciate ng tao. Kasi kung na-mystify yan, doon nagkakaroon ng kung ano-anong marites, di ba? So I'm just trying to push back against the marites and also, explain to people what are the things being done by legitimate. Of course, they're fake survey agents. We'll talk about those things later on. But for legitimate institutions, how do you safeguard against those things? Yeah.
Well, una, you don't seek permission from the barangay.
Right. Right.
There are occasions, quite
Yeah.
rare, where our interviewers are essentially asked to go to the barangay hall. In those cases, we ask them to contact us, and if we feel that it's really not, it will affect the integrity of the survey, we just randomly select
Yeah.
a new barangay. Rare occasions, Richard. When I say rare, that means it would not necessarily happen in our national surveys. It more or less happens in our local surveys, the ones that are commissioned.
Exactly.
Closer to elections, when people really are quite uh, sensitive to people who are moving around, and the candidates, the contenders themselves, are the ones that are monitoring who are the outsiders. In those
Right.
cases, we given the expertise of our field interviewers, there are ways by which we basically look at the
Yeah.
maneuvers, no, in order to avoid. But in our regular surveys, we have rarely had an experience wherein you have someone who is really intimidating our interviewers. You
Yeah.
have someone who is failing our interviewers. This is for the national surveys kasi
Yeah.
masyado disperse eh.
Yeah.
Ang barangay kasi, ang local survey, medyo if you have 600 respondents, if the locality is small,
Yeah.
it's more concentrated, right? But not, and even in those local surveys, it's not so frequent that it's quite rare that we experience yung people who are being monitored or
Yeah.
accompanied by officials. When that happens, we ask our interviewers to immediately tell us, the
To
field
or suspend?
supervisors,
Yeah, yeah.
just simply select
Mm.
a new sample spot or barangay.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a protocol na, yeah, I mean, if something dodgy, suspend it or discard na lang the
Yeah.
sample, no? Yeah, kasi
Yeah.
you're right, it's so hard to coordinate on the national level. Bantayan nyo kung sino mga postation dyan pag nandun sila. You're like, the level of the nation, that's quite hard. But if this is like a small fight among 12 barangays, as random as you're gonna be, you can, you can better coordinate ways to intimidate it. But what you're saying is that there's still protocols to
Mm.
deal with those situations. Do you also rely on like locals to do the surveys for you, like or it's like people from Manila are parachuted into different areas? How does it happen?
No,
Like,
no, no. In the people who do the surveys in the provinces are in those provinces,
so they're from
because
there.
the survey would be administered using the vernacular. So that means
Ah,
that
right, right.
these are people who, for example, if you do a survey, part if the sample is in somewhere in the northern Luzon areas, then
Yeah.
those are people who should be able to
Ilocano,
speak
yeah,
Ilocano.
yeah.
Because you give the option to the respondent what questionnaire they will use, whether they will use the Filipino, which is the controlling language that we have, the
Uh-huh.
Tagalog, or English, or the local language. And in this case, it is best for us to continually tap the interviewers who already are in that area. Those are interviewers that we train before we send them out to the field. So in each of our surveys, there's always a field interviewer training. Even if many of the questions are repeated in our surveys, we still conduct the training, and we attend those training more often than not. Now the training is via Zoom, and then those trainings are replicated in every area. So we have trainings for people who do the survey in Luzon and the Visayas and Mindanao. Um, so they're not shipped out, no? They're not coming all
Hindi
from.
commando operation, hindi siya ganun, no? And
They,
do they have like ID, Ronald? Like, like ako po, taga
they
Pulse
have
Asia, ito po pangalan.
identification
Yeah,
cards.
yeah.
Yeah. They have identification cards. Normally, their identification cards are with our data collection partners. When they introduce themselves as part of the data collection team, but conducting a survey for Pulse Asia. So we do that. I mean, the last time I did a pilot for our survey, I went to Zamboanga, and the interviewers that I had were all from Zamboanga, and
Mm,
we were doing a survey on countering violent extremism.
right.
Um, so we don't, because who can speak Chabacano coming from Manila? You
From
will not
Manila,
even
right?
understand.
Medyo, yeah, yeah.
Or Bisaya.
Correct.
So you need someone from those areas.
Yeah, and the variations, like we don't speak Ilocano the same way in Baguio than say, I don't know, in Batak, right? Or Santa Maria, right? So you really need people on the ground. Now, how do you make sure that when they translate it into vernacular, these are not leading questions? So essentially, I'm asking the question, how do you make sure that the questions are not leading questions, including when they are translated into vernacular by your people on the ground?
Yeah, so there's back translation always.
Ah,
There's
okay.
translation from the
Right.
Filipino to the vernacular,
So
and
now
then you
quality
translate it back
control na siya.
to
Yeah.
Filipino. There's always that back translation. Since many of our questions have been really used from one survey to another, so the bulk of the questions have really been proven in terms of reliability and validity in terms of translation. But when we have new questions, we do back translations.
And one more question on this. Sorry, I'm asking all of this background because I think really we have to understand how it. Yeah. Like, do you also do like, I don't know, parang rotations, or is there like a every few year checking whether you guys on the ground are still okay? They're, what I'm saying. Like, how do you make sure that you sustain credible, surveying on the ground by your people?
Well, there are, well, in terms of interviewers, we do have a pool of interviewers with our data collection partners. We have
Yeah.
data collection partners that we work with for quite some time. Uh, so we trust them, and we ourselves, our own staff in Pulse Asia, accompany them. So in that case, our own staff become some sort of observers and supervisors. They are able
Right.
to report back to us what transpired during the interviews. And in those observations, they basically validate what we feel is the competency of our data collection partners. So we've had no problems with them. And normally, that's the same thing that you'll find with regard to market research groups.
Yeah.
They tap the same people, and these people are people who are quite professional in doing their work. You don't really have to rotate them. You don't really have to replace them. They look forward to the work, and they're quite really used to doing the surveys. Many of our interviewers are women, because I think in our culture, when
Mas
it's less
komportable ka kung mausap
intimidating,
mo. Yeah.
when a woman, knocks on the door and asks and introduces herself as a enumerator. We do have a number of male enumerators, but most of them are women.
And Ronnie, have you noticed, like, I mean, did you notice that, like, people are actually excited to share like they feel empowered? I mean, ako napansin ko yun in the little, student level I did, na parang natutuwa sila na you care about their opinion, even if nahirapan sila or they have to take away time, even if they're not paid for it, they feel a sense of empowerment, like they're being heard, right?
Yeah, and that's always the case.
Yeah.
What we do see is the enthusiasm. We try to avoid lengthening the survey to the extent that there's already fatigue on the part of the respondent. But they're willing to share. They're all open. I mean, and the other thing that we do in the instrument itself, we tend to shuffle the sequence
Yeah.
of the question so that some because if you just keep the same sequence, some questions at the end might not necessarily be answered as energetically. So we shuffle it just to make sure that the responses would be more or less even in terms of attention given by the respondents. So, we have not encountered, at least in my case, I have not observed an interview where the respondent has become agitated. They're Some of them are agitated in a positive way, very passionate,
I mean, excited sila. Oh.
expressing
Yeah.
their view, even extending beyond just answering the question, providing
May
an
mga
explanation.
ganun, no? Medyo makwento pa. Yeah.
That's
Madaldal
something that
types.
you would expect, no?
Yeah.
Because in the first place, you're talking to people who already agreed to be interviewed.
Yes.
So you should expect them that they would
Expressive
go
sila.
into certain statements that might go beyond what you're actually
Yeah.
asking.
So that pasensyoso ka talaga. Now, Ronnie, I think nag-warm up na tayo. Now, let's go for it. Mag-heart talk na tayo. First question I wanna ask dito sa heart talk part, like the latter part of our interview. Sorry kung pinahaba ko yan because I just wanted to demystify a lot of misunderstanding about this. First of all, what do you think about digital surveys? And because I mean I've observed many digital surveys and they give wildly different outcomes. Is it because some are dodgy and some are not, or is it because inherently digital surveys cannot have the accuracy that your more quote unquote analog version of surveys possess?
Well, but what you mean by digital is something that is done online.
Yung sa mobile or internet, I don't know, or whatever, yeah.
Then there would be limitations.
Mm.
The more common digital survey done right now, especially in market research, is what is referred to as the panel, the one where you do a representative survey from a panel of respondents. Many companies have gathered several respondents, no? And they have a panel of about 300,000 in their pool, and you select some from those 300 from
Right.
that 300,000. So that's one type of survey sampling that is done right now. The problem with that one is that in some panels, that's actually an opt-in panel. That means that you're asked whether you wish to participate. It's incentivized event.
Yeah.
And we find out, for example, in many countries, including the Philippines, that there's a tendency for this to be the participants there in that panel to be more urban based, to be much more highly educated, belonging to a younger group, right?
Yeah. So may bias
Uh,
ka agad yung data mo kasi
eh,
it's a slice of the pizza, not the complete
yeah,
representative. Yeah, yeah.
so there is a limitation. The other thing that we should remember is that we still have a digital divide, although it's not as huge as it was,
Exactly.
let's say, a year
Yeah.
ago. No, in our own surveys, we find out that about 3 out of 4 Filipinos have access to the internet now,
Yeah.
largely to their smartphone. So, but that rules out 25% still. Now, we've tried doing our own digital surveys, but the problem with the digital survey using the mobile phone, Richard, is that you don't have a sampling frame. You don't know who's using that mobile phone.
Yun pa. Yeah, exactly. You don't know exactly. Yeah.
There's no mobile phone directory,
Correct,
right?
correct.
We tried reaching out to mobile phone providers, the service providers, to ask them just basic questions. How many subscribers are there in regions 1, 2,
Yeah.
3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9? What are the age distributions? They cannot provide us that because it's also proprietary information.
Yun nga eh. Yun nga. I was thinking about the yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it's not going to be difficult to do a sampling frame when you don't have those data,
Yeah.
right? And that's the reason why we cannot do the random selection of random generation of mobile phone numbers. As I was telling one group, for example, my family has 5 mobile phones, but one mobile phone holder might be a 16-year-old
Yeah.
guy, no, who we're not supposed to be interviewing. So
So the quality
there are
control will be difficult too. Yeah.
so there are limitations to that one. And then you have this type of service digital where you go online and then people just opt in.
Yeah.
That's the least probabilistic because again that's convenient. No?
Yeah.
Basically, may self-selection bias and the ones
Right.
who wish to participate will participate.
Yung mga bibo lang nasa sample but they're not necessarily a representative of the broader voting population. As I said, malay mo yung 12-year-old na bibo is voting for 4 different person or whatever, right? All through the... Now, nevertheless, I noticed in the last elections, hindi masyadong malayo maraming mga digital surveys dun sa mga sinasabi ng Pulse Asia. Is that a coincidence or is that, like, how do you explain that? I mean, there were dodgy surveys. I'm not gonna name names, like sobrang layo. Pero a lot of them were not too far from what we saw with Pulse Asia or SWS.
Yeah, might be a coincidence. Might be a function of whatever statistical balancing or treatment they did.
Yeah.
But I would say that it would be hard to see whether that one can be replicated, because it really depends on what their methods are. Unfortunately, Richard, I don't know what the methods, the sampling methodology of those surveys were.
Yeah, maybe I should interview them also on that. No, but you guys in Pulse Asia are not thinking of doing a kind of a digital supplementary.
We
Yeah.
we are, but it's basically what we do is what other survey organizations do. We ask our respondents of in prior surveys whether they're willing to be interviewed either face to face or online subsequently.
Yeah.
But you have to build that huge database.
Yeah.
We learned that we did that during the pandemic, because during the pandemic it was really pretty hard for us to
Yung
do
pa,
a
actually,
face-to-face
oo.
interview. We actually missed 2 rounds of our quarterly survey because of the pandemic. But again, the gold standard is still face-to-face interviews worldwide. It's not done in other countries because it's
Right.
expensive, but it remains the gold standard in doing surveys.
Now, I think that's it perfectly for my next question. Now, you already said your thing on so your argument is that with the problem with the digital kind of mobile base is that you already have a selection bias there because you're reaching out to people you don't even know their age who have access to cell phones and all. Now, we saw the explosion of the so-called Google Trends in the last elections, and similar arguments were made against it, right? Including by yours truly. I mean, obviously, you're looking at people who have access to internet, reliable internet throughout time and throughout space. And then the other thing is, Google Trends just looks at whether you're interested in a certain topic. So I may be interested in, I don't, looking at what's happening with person X, but because maybe I hate that person, that's why I'm checking that person, right? Not necessarily because I want to vote for that person. What is your take on the whole Google Trends discourse? And as someone who does legitimate surveys, how do you feel about that? I know this is where the contentious part comes in, but I think we really have to honestly talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I've read some articles in scholarly journals that basically look at not only Google Trends but also Facebook postings,
Yeah.
social media postings,
Metadatas. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, as means of predicting voting behavior. But what they do is that it's not just on a specific time frame, not just during the election
Yeah,
period.
it's
They look
ancient.
back across time. They look at postings that say several years back. They look at the consistency in order to determine the political inclination of a particular individual
Right.
who tends to be, well, in a sense, it's a complete digital footprint. And it's not just using a search at a particular
Uh-huh.
point or period of time in Google. So it's a study in itself
Longitudinal. Yeah.
that's longitudinal.
Yeah.
And I don't think that we have that capacity that people who said that Google Trends can be predictive in the Philippines did that work. They basically just work with the data that you can find in Google Trends, like what is the rate
Yeah,
of
yeah,
searching
exactly. Yeah.
for a particular candidate, which we found was also not that significant in terms of frequency. Yeah, because you're looking at just what less than 100,000 searches for a particular period.
And not
So
necessarily representative, right? Because these are people who have
not
access
not
to Google, proper
yeah,
internet to even search it. Yeah.
not representative, and does not in any way indicate really the political leanings of those who are
Yeah.
searching. So if you wish to do that, then you have to do a much more thorough sentiment analysis,
Yeah.
working with all the platforms. No? But that's much more difficult now, no? Given
Yeah.
all of the privacy settings that have been set up.
Especially with
Uh,
Apple also, right? If you're using Apple kasi medyo mas restrictive siya in terms of not being tracked, etc. So
yeah.
so what you're saying is that in theory, metadata or big data analysis could be helpful, but Google Trends as it was deployed in the last elections was just a surface level, very, essentially slice of that kind of approach, no, or methodology. So you're
And
saying metadata could work, but Google Trends was not exactly a full consummation of that methodology.
yeah, and you need to do some sampling also for that metadata to be really truly representative also.
Yeah,
And that's
exactly.
another thing. No? I'm not someone who is capable of doing that, but I think those who are in big data would
Yeah.
really need to define how, because the problem was that many of the so-called data analytic people who predicted that it would be a close contest
Right.
we're really quite off, no, in terms of prediction. In the last, they said that in France it worked, and then in other countries it worked. But in the Philippines, it definitely was far from what we saw.
Yeah.
Unless you believe all of the allegations that the elections there was massive fraud that happened in the 2022 elections.
Yeah, I mean, which I think brings me to the next question. I mean, the 2008, diba, since you have been, at the helm of the Pulse Asia, did you imagine that it will come to a time whereby you'll be so much at the receiving end of so many attacks, questioning your integrity, your institutions, or a lot of some would say, of course, unfair attacks against this kind of surveys. People who don't even understand how scientific surveys. I mean, so this is more of a personal question, Ronnie. I mean, Ronnie, I have my own share of being trolled, so I understand how stressful it can get. But I want to hear it from you. How difficult what is, because the reason I say this, Ronnie, is because I know you, and many of us, your colleagues, know you as someone who has fought for democracy throughout decades. We know you're someone who cares about democracy, who fought for the progress of civil liberties and political rights in this country. So I can imagine, I mean, kung ikaw ay isang corporate person, you're really in it for money, may annoy ka lang. But if you're a person who are doing service and at the same time you have this long lifelong commitment to democratization and freedom in the country. Like I suppose it's doubly painful, right? I mean, how did you feel about all of those attacks against Pulse Asia in particular? Because you're the most prominent survey agency. I mean, presidents respond when there's a Pulse Asia survey. They don't necessarily respond to other surveys, no offense to them, but when Pulse Asia comes out, people respond, right? Big people respond. So you guys really matter, but unfortunately, with mattering also comes a lot of attacks, including from people that we expected more from, to be honest about it.
Well, yeah. Actually, the one that has much more of an impact in terms of your own mental health would be the ones who you think know you better and yet do not in any way trust or even question, no, your trustworthiness in this
Yeah.
case. Um, and it's become a bit more toxic, no, specifically as the elections progress. It was the same also. In 2010, we were being accused of being Dilawan. In
Yeah.
2016, we were being accused by the Dilawans of being Bayarans. In 2022, we were also being accused of being Bayarans. Now that I don't know what the accusation is right now. But as you said, but Richard, the thing is that regardless of what we find out, and in many occasions I've told close friends, I tend to
Yeah.
disagree with the findings. But we don't have any choice but to release the findings, so whether we agree or
Yeah.
disagree with it, whether we think that this is the appropriate voting behavior or opinion on the issue. It's just that we stand pat on the integrity of the process. We believe that this is a systematically done survey. And as an academic organization, we are bound to disseminate the results and face the criticism from peers. No? If there are flaws in the methodology, there is a flaw in the question, then we will work towards refining those methods and those questions. But if the attack is on our personal integrity, then that
Yeah, ibang
definitely, I
usapan
think,
yan
is
eh.
it's really below the belt.
Yeah, there was a lot of below the belt, including by some of us who try to question, the questioning of your integrity. We noticed how toxic things would get over there as well. At least you're saying that that was not the first time 2010 pa lang, na feel niyan. But I think last election was pretty difficult because it came from a side that perhaps you would have expected to have more sympathy for academics, independent-minded people, and Democrats for that matter, like how did you cope with it on a human level? Like, I'm sure it was. I mean, like, what you started cooking, doing vlogs. Like, my whole vlogging was my therapy, right? It's like,
Well,
atake nyo ako. Sige,
well,
I'll do vlogs, right? Let's go for it. This is my therapy. What's yours,
well,
Ronnie?
no, cooking has always been a therapy for me, even when I was in school administration.
Okay.
So it's one way to take my attention away from all the problems that I did not
Right.
in any way create.
Yeah.
So I did more cooking, but there were occasions when I could not anymore cook because I was definitely affected by all of the criticisms, especially from people that were supposed to know me better.
I know.
I don't care about those who I don't know.
Yeah.
And you do get that. I avoided social media as much as possible. I will not in any way look at Twitter. I will not look at Facebook. My Facebook does not even have anything political. I mean,
Kaya nga, ang daming food eh.
occasionally I do when I feel very strongly about an issue,
Right.
especially when it involves human rights.
Yeah.
But if it's just a question of, let's say, an action taken by a politician, I would not even comment.
Yeah.
Because people might say, "Oh, you're biased against this person or
I
that
know you're.
person."
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
So,
Ronnie, I mean, to be half joking about it, if I didn't know you and then I check your, your feed sa face, I would say, pwede yan mag-Michelin star, like you could be that guy, right? Kasi medyo similar din daw. They come in anonymously, you don't know, they're just food critics, Their job is not too different from yours. Like you're like the Michelin star of Philippine politics, right? Now, let's go to the last part of our discussion. Really, really last part. I know medyo tumagal ito, but Ronnie, kasi first time natin mag-usap ng mabuti in a public sense. So sorry if I had to really go deep, but I'm not sorry. I think this is very important. Now, let's put on your political scientist hat, right? what is your reading of surveys longitudinally throughout the past 10, 15 years? Before we go to individuals, let's talk about issues. Is corruption as important to the Filipino voters as it was back in the day? Because my understanding is based on Pulse Asia, let's say 2009, 2008 to 2010, mukhang the concerns with corruption perhaps was more close to people compared to today? Or like, what does data say about importance of good governance for voters
Well,
compared to
it,
economic issues? Yeah.
it was a more prominent issue in the latter part of the Arroyo administration, and it became even more prominent in the first part of the Aquino administration.
Right.
Largely because then Noynoy Aquino basically signaled that this is an issue that they would address. As I mentioned in the past in some other interviews, you do have that presidential signaling effect. So when the president impresses upon the public that this is an important issue, people tend to regard it as an important issue. We saw this in Duterte
presidential
also,
signal.
when he said illegal drugs is a your urgent concern. Suddenly you have a spike in terms of people
I mean,
saying,
he did it as a presidential candidate, right? I remember before him becoming president, biglang out of nowhere, nagiging importante itong crime and criminality
fighting
issues.
criminality is
Yeah,
an important
as a
issue.
candidate pa lang, di ba? He was able to do that. That's how powerful it was. Yeah.
But corruption has always been in the top five. Among governance issues,
Yeah.
it is the issue that has remained, at least in the top five, the ones that people feel that the government should immediately address. It has not stayed in the top three. The top three
Yeah.
that we've seen over the past years since 1999.
Inflation,
Basically,
employment,
both
yeah.
material
Yeah.
got issues,
Yeah.
high prices, pay, poverty, jobs. So they basically switched position, but inflation has always been number one. Does it mean that people do not give that much importance to good governance? I don't really think so. I think to a certain extent, because we've seen this in local surveys that we do, I think people still think that it's important for government to function, but that expectation might be really more at the level of the local government. At the national government, there might be other expectations, and it really depends on what is given more emphasis
Right.
by the national administration or the president for that matter.
So we see, like, for instance, the issue of law and order, right? Not as important if you look at the surveys right now, when in fact, not long ago, we thought that's the end all be all issue. That's the most important thing, and hence perhaps the popularity of former president, right? I mean,
Yep,
the
yep.
presidential signaling, as you say, is important. And in case now, speaking of foreign policy, for instance, one of the things sorry for being a little bit selfish here because this is kind of my area. We always hear that if you look at the list of most urgent issue, minsan medyo mababa talagang foreign policy as a kind of an urgent issue. Nevertheless, also, it looks like whenever something big happens in West Philippine Sea, nabuli yung mga inista na, there's an explosion of public response, and suddenly presidents have to care about, because Pulse Asia has done a lot of surveys that shows like what 8 out of 10 Filipinos want us to take tougher stance in the South China Sea. Many things that Duterte as a popular president was going against. I mean, how do you explain that? Is it like a cyclically important issue, not consistently urgent, but cyclically important that could still impact policy? Yeah.
Well, it's important, but relative to the other concerns, it's not as urgent.
Yes.
So when you ask people separately what do they think about the West Philippine Sea and our territorial claims, they will tend to say that it's something that we should fight for. But when you range it against other issues, it's not as urgent.
Yeah.
Right? So people do see the importance of, let's say, ensuring our territorial integrity. And they, for example, under this administration, and even in the previous administration, perplexingly, the administration was getting high approval ratings in defending our territorial integrity.
Especially Mindanao. I saw the SW surveys in Mindanao. You had very high also, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so that's saying, as I said, it's perplexing, despite the fact that in the previous administration, it was only late in the administration when basically the president continually invoked the ruling that basically bestowed legitimacy on our claims. No? But people feel that it's
Interesting.
important, but not as urgent as, let's say, the gut issues.
And therefore they gave
And
some room for maneuver maybe to President Duterte, and the way his foreign policy was interpreted on the ground perhaps is different from what many outside saw, no, or his critics see. So
uh,
now I'm just trying to explain the seeming paradox there, you know. Now let's talk about the latest survey, because President Marcos Jr., I mean, 65% approval rating. That's like a golden number in a U.S. democracy or European democracy. Like, I mean, Biden would have. I mean, Biden's biggest dream would be to have a 60-70% approval rating. Nevertheless, it's much lower than all the. You know, I mean, I think Aquino was around 77% at this point in time in some of the surveys. Duterte was around 80%. Uh, are people exaggerating that, oh, like BBM has to be troubled, or the drop by 15 points is really something special, including I think 29% drop among Class E and 21 or 22% among ABC. So medyo swerte siya kasi it held among Class D, who are the biggest proportion, right? We can debate about the reasons behind, but it looks pretty significant in at least 2 out of 3 demographics, albeit the smaller ones. How important? I mean,
yeah,
how big was that? If you're BBM, should you be worried? I mean, you still have 65% approval.
yeah, I guess any president should be worried about this one, although 65. And I do agree. Leaders in other countries
Yeah.
would be happy with it. But when you suffer a 15-point drop, that's quite significant. Especially since, I think we're coming from a situation that people are not necessarily unfamiliar with. Inflation has continually increased over the past year. Maybe people tempered their expectations over the past year, but suddenly, given that there's no end to it,
Right.
we'll withdraw
Medyo napuno na.
the
Oo.
will withdraw the approval. But they shifted more to indecision, Richard, rather than
Ah,
disapproving.
that's a good
So
point.
that means
That's a
they're
good
still
point.
essentially on a wait and see attitude. Now, whether this will continue to decline is something that we cannot predict. We'll see it in the next quarterly survey. But it's the highest decline we've seen for the same period of time
Yeah.
uh, compared to previous presidents, because, as you said, Aquino was 72, Duterte was
Yeah.
80.
Right.
They started off at 79 and 86 respectively. So the decline was not significant if you compare it from where they started off. Marcos
Right.
started at 84, it's down to 65. So that's a 19-point drop in his case. And any president should be worried. And I think he's acting as such.
Yeah.
Speaking as a political scientist, because
Exactly.
he's been going around distributing rice. He took out the price ceiling on rice, believing that the harvest will be sufficient to stabilize the price of rice at least in the next quarter. And I think they take every measure necessary, like Duterte did in September 2018
The
when the
Kian de los
same
Santos
issue came
case.
up. The
You're
rice
the
price
rice
was
price. Ah, yeah, rice
prices
tarification law. Yeah, yeah.
his approval went down by double digit then. I
Yeah,
think
but
it was
not
about
15, about 11 yata or something like that. Parang
13
13. Yeah,
points,
yeah,
but
yeah,
still
yeah,
quite
yeah.
significant. But 75 pa rin yun natatanda ko, Richard.
Right.
It's still high, but you scamper. Every time that
Oo nga, no?
people
Okay.
withhold or withdraw approval, people are quite sensitive to it, although they say they're not necessarily sensitive
Of
to it.
course,
I think
yeah.
political leaders are quite sensitive to it, because unless they arrest that decline, they will be facing more challenges. And in this current environment where you see also some sort of intramurals among our political leaders, the last thing that you would want to
You're right.
happen is that your political capital is reduced, as evidenced by lower approval or trust ratings.
Um, yeah, I mean, you're right. Actually, I remember like Duterte twice at least. No, double. One was with the Kian de los Santos. The other one was this when the whole rice issue and rice tarification law came in. But nevertheless, there was a Teflon effect, right? I mean, I hate to use that term, but just so that it's relatable to people. Like he showed tremendous amount of resilience in terms of keeping his numbers in the 70, 80, at some point even 90 territory. But
Yeah.
mukhang that's not the case now, right? With the I mean, I would even say even Aquino had the semi-Teflon effect, right? He still went out with majority approval despite all the, you know, he bungled the whole Mama Sapano, the whole, laglag bala. So is Marcos Jr. showing less resilience? Is the honeymoon over? I mean, what's the proper way of framing it? Or just to say it's too early to say, it's just a short-term signaling or flash in the pan. What is your hunch here? As a political scientist, not the Pulse Asia guy.
Yeah, well, the current conditions make it a little bit more difficult for him to sustain the
Mm,
level of approval that he had in the past. For one, the economy has really been challenged
yeah,
given
yeah.
all of the external
So
developments. But
structural,
the other,
yeah.
yeah, but the other thing that is confronting right now is, as I said, the internal differences, or would, I mean, avoiding it to become a turmoil among members of or factions of his unit team. We
Yeah.
see it now. No, it's too early for this type of politicking to happen.
But the
Uh,
midterm elections is near, right? I mean, the
yeah, but
alignments are
that,
gonna
that
happen
that's
now. Yeah.
that's that's still too early. We people always compare it. Let's say, for example, the time of Neumann, the vice president then Jojo Binay, of course, was known to have political ambitions,
Right.
but I don't think that Binay made that there was any significant in what's this attack on then Vice President Binay until late in that
Yes.
administration.
Right.
The midterm was a midterm that was partyless also. You had Team Pinoy and the United
Right.
Nationalist Alliance. It might turn out to be the same now. It's going to be partyless. It's basically a coalition. But the conflict within the administration started, I mean, the problems within the administration started quite early for an administration that came into power with majority voting support.
Yeah. You're of course referring to the Romualdez Arroyo, then the whole
But
Tambaloslos and all of
even
that. Yeah, yeah,
the
yeah.
resignation of the executive secretary,
Mm.
the placement of some of the
The
secretaries,
purge.
and then now the conflict, the supposed
Yeah.
conflict between the House Speaker, the renewed conflict between the House Speaker and the Vice President, allegedly because of the decision of the former to strip the latter of the confidential intelligence funds.
Yeah. See, this is the part of you I think people should hear more. Your political analyst side kasi you're always the Pulse Asia side. Para kang Superman na ano ka parati ka na you're just stuck. So I just wanted people to hear that, in terms of your analysis. Now, the last one, let's talk about Sara Duterte, right? I mean, first of all, my sense is perhaps if the survey was in the second half of September, or I mean, I know your cycles, but I'm just saying, my sense is if it were in the second half of September, perhaps her numbers would have probably dropped even more. And my hypothesis is because if you look at the whole confidential issue controversy, I mean, I'm not saying anything because uh, you know, uh, she's presumed innocent. But concerns with good governance, I think, really culminated towards the end of September. So I won't be surprised if her numbers would have dropped more if the survey was in the second half rather than the first half or middle of September. But nevertheless, it's also a curious thing that she had 11 points drop. I mean, she's not the president. She's not the Department of Agriculture secretary. Both of those are Marcos Jr., of course, right? And yet she's still seeing that drop, right? And I would have expected her to be actually more resilient because, diba, there's supposed to be solid South, Vismin vote. And we saw some drop even in her Mindanao numbers, something like 95 to 87, 86, something like that. What's going on with the Sara situation? What is your political analysis there?
It's really a drop in two different areas in the National Capital Region and the Balsa Luzon, where I think the public basically is withholding support
From the
from the national
entire,
president.
yeah, yeah.
The decline she suffered in the Visayas and Mindanao are still within the margin of error from survey to survey. So it's a marginal decline, although it's a drop of 9 points, I think, in Mindanao, but it's not so significant relative to the decline across all areas of the president. And you're correct. But if the survey was done
Exactly,
towards the latter
second half,
part of the
yeah.
month, where there was really much more news about, let's say, the transfer of funds to
Yeah,
her
confidential fund issue,
in
yeah.
2022 and how she spent those funds in 11 days. The questions being raised by people from various political fronts, maybe it would have an impact
Yeah.
separately from the impact of, let's say, inflation on the performance rating of top officials.
Or maybe BBM's number would have been slightly better because as important as the, kasi he also had big drops sa ABC, diba? 21,
Yeah,
22%, right? And my sense is, um,
22.
22, right? 22. So my sense is probably BBM would have done slightly better. Maybe the numbers would have closed at 13%. I mean, it's very speculative, but I'm looking at news cycles and the emotionality of the moment and public discontent. I think confidential issue was far bigger issue towards the end, no? Especially for
But,
for
but remember,
ABC. Yeah.
if opponents of BBM were to raise that same issue, can raise actually the same issue to him because the
Yeah.
transfer came from the office of the president. And the transfer is, from the words of one of the minority leaders, illegal and even unconstitutional. It's
Si
almost
Edsel
similar to
Lagman,
what
I suppose, no? Yeah, yeah.
the assertions before about the disbursement acceleration program under Noynoy Aquino,
Right.
right?
And Bersamin
That-
being in the
that's-
Supreme Court, yeah, back then. Yeah,
you cannot transfer to items
Yeah.
that are not existent
Yeah.
in the budgets of other agencies. And in this case, the claim is that there was no budget for CIF under the former vice president. So therefore, how can you transfer funds to the budget of the incumbent vice president? So the president could be held accountable also
Either way.
his opponents would raise it. Fortunately for them, it was not as deliberated yet when we
Yeah.
did the survey. Let's see whether this will still be salient as a political issue come the fourth quarter survey.
Ronald, thank you so much. Ronnie, thank you so much for this very comprehensive interview. I really juiced you out both as the False Asia chief and at the same time as a fellow political scientist and longtime colleague. Maraming salamat, Ronnie. Thank you. I hope I can disturb you in the future, in the next quarters. I know you're super in demand, but I think people want really in-depth analysis, hindi lang yung mga 2 to 3 minutes quotable quotes. I hope people will look forward to also our discussions. I really appreciate your analysis, Ronnie, and mabuhay ka. More power to you. Is there
Okay,
anything you want to
bye-bye.
say? I mean, is there any parting words or something like that?
No.
Oh.
Keep,
Mabait ka
well,
talaga.
Richard.
Okay, mabait ka, Ronnie.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Have a good day. God bless. Okay. All right. Sorry, medyo late tayo nag-start. Thank you so much, everyone. Sorry, late tayo nag-start. Again, I know, marami dyan may mga preconceived notions about surveys and pulsation and all, but I hope you gave benefit of the doubt and pinakinggan niyo yung explanations ni Ronnie. Of course, medyo late. I'm sure everyone was tired and all, but I really appreciate Ronnie's efforts to share his point of view. And I hope you guys also appreciate it. Don't worry, a better version of the audio. I know you're having problems with audio kasi hindi ko nilagay dito sa cellphones ko, but hopefully the Zoom one has much better audio. So, hintayin niyan, we're gonna release it within the next 24 hours. Alright? On that note, thank you very much and God bless.